Okay, I think people are going to still start coming in, but we should get going in the interests of time. So, welcome everyone to the second in our mental health and wellness series of webinars. And tonight, I'm really excited and pleased that we're going to be talking about cultivating positive body image in sport and specifically in volleyball. And just to get started, I want to introduce myself as Emma Gibbons. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Volleyball BC, and I am coming to you today from the traditional lands and territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish Nation, and the Musqueam, because our offices and headquarters are based in Burnaby. But obviously, as the provincial sport body, we operate all around this beautiful province, and we're very grateful and thankful to be playing the sport of volleyball on lands across this province. So without further ado, I'm excited to get going. This is going to be another double act between our mental health ambassadors and Dr. Shaunna Taylor. So I'd like to introduce everyone who probably doesn't need any introduction is Shanice Marcelle, who is a well-known and loved beach volleyball player. And then joining us later, hopefully, we have Kyla Richey and Thiessen, and they will be contributing their own personal experiences in terms of this whole topic area. But leading us in tonight's webinar is Dr. Shaunna Taylor, who is the past chair of the Canadian Sports Psychology Association and also works out of UBC as in the areas of high performance coaching and leadership. She has been a co-collaborator with me on the mental health toolkit that we've launched for our community. And we're very excited to record this webinar tonight and provide it to all of you here live, but also add it as one of the assets on our website. So I'm going to pass it over to Shaunna, but I did want to highlight that we do have, I believe, the chat function open, and we also have a Q&A function. So if you have any questions during the session, please post them in either of those. I will be monitoring it, and I will be able to pose them to Shaunna or Shanice, and we'll go from there. So without further ado, Shaunna, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say hello to everyone from where I am actually reaching you all. I know we're all virtual, but I'm so privileged to be living, working, playing, training, living on the unceded traditional territory of the Syilx Nation. And I'm coming to you from Kelowna, BC. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm really looking forward to this topic tonight. It has a very strong significance in my life. I've worked in this area for a very long time. I worked at the Ottawa General Hospital for many years, helping both athletes, but general population, and also in pediatrics and body image in children. So this holds a tremendous amount of meaning for me. And I know our ambassadors also felt this was a really important topic too. So I'm really excited to have some of them chime in as well. Some of the core topics that we'll be talking about today is we're going to kick things off really about understanding some core definitions about what body image is, and also talking a little bit about the global phenomenon of diet culture. Some people also call it body fascism, but trying to put it into words that coaches, parents, and athletes can understand and figure out how that translates into their lives and how to make volleyball a safe, accessible, and positive place when it comes to how we feel and how we relate to our bodies. So some of the places we're going to be focusing are these 5 core areas tonight. So how we communicate and talk about the body, how we talk about our sense of self, and things like food even, and how we nourish ourselves and how we move. Also, how we talk about well-being, and to be careful that we're not using the body and discussion about one's body as almost like a punitive measure, as though it's somehow at the center of everything, of the aesthetic. Because volleyball is a sport where certainly, I mean, you have some amazing talented athletes, but it's really trying to centralize some of the core meaning behind what we're doing as being adding to their well-being, which leads to high performance, and not that they have to look a certain way that is prejudged for them by society, because we get enough outside pressure as it is, really going off true performance indicators. And body type and composition are not a performance indicator. Food first versus diet culture is another area we'll be looking at. Flexible uniforms, flexible equipment, less so equipment, I think, in volleyball, but we're going to talk a bit more about some flexibility in uniforming so people's body, so people can feel good and feel confident about their body playing the sport of volleyball, and then an inclusive culture and what that might mean. So these are the 5 areas that we're going to focus on tonight. So to start out, body image in sport, I think whenever I get asked to talk about this, the first thing I say is when they say, well, what is body image? I always say it's complicated. It's a really complicated relationship because it's this interconnection between, who we are and our sense of self-esteem and what we're worth. Our body truly is our vessel in sport, right? Because it's your instrument. It's what you're doing sport with. So it is on display. But we all have our own very unique genetic predisposition. We have social determinants as well. We have cultural pieces that lean into who we are. And if we try too hard to go out of a certain range, for example, in body composition, we might get to a point where it starts to limit our performance. We might have an up in performance initially, but for example, with extreme dieting, quote unquote, where we're changing some of those natural set points that we have, that body image that we might be trying to alter can actually have an impact on our self-image and also our health and even our performance outcomes as well. So it is complicated. They're all interconnected, but they're complicated. So what I like to talk about in some of the courses that I teach at University of British Columbia and before when I worked at University of Ottawa, I try to introduce this idea to athletes and to coaches that want to join us and parents of this idea of body activism. And that sounds radical, I know, but it kind of is radical because we in sport are working against some bigger forces that are putting pressure on all of us to look and act a certain way, right? And sport participation can be a beautiful thing. It can build character. We can feel more fit. We can achieve all kinds of amazing performance elements, but we are still part of a bigger ecosystem that is largely determined by, I used the term body fascism earlier. Some people are more familiar with the term diet culture. So whoever the ruling power is, depending on what society you're in, they will dictate what that ideal body is supposed to look like. And so right now, we've got all kinds of mirrors all around us. We've got social media. We've got the entertainment industry. We have high performance sport where we have athletes who are literally doing nothing but training, right, to look like that. And then you've got your average 14-year-old person playing volleyball who's got all these confusing images from this broader culture of what they're supposed to look like. And so body activism is a pushing back and trying to introduce this concept that, you know what, volleyball is the kind of sport where anybody can play. Like, we need to get you some comfort in your body, find a position, find some skills, find the strength, find the speed, find true performance indicators that make you feel like you fit in volleyball. And that is all across the gender spectrum. So that's wherever you identify, she, her, he, him, them, they, and anywhere in between, non-binary. We want everyone to feel like there is a place for their body as it is in volleyball. And so that's really what body activism is. It's sort of a pushback against some of these forces that are working against us. The biggest one, I think, being the diet culture industry that is walking hand in hand with sport. And it's very insidious, a little bit sneaky, hiding in plain sight. Many coaches are using language that is actually fueled by the diet industry, using words that have morality behind them to describe certain food that you might be eating as being good or bad. So a moral judgment on an inanimate object like food, right? Or a certain body type being lazy simply because of the physical appearance, well, that is lazy when you look at that body type. So this is something I've been working with really my whole career, trying to work on the language, work on the underlying prejudices that are underneath, and why we need this idea of body activism to take root in all of our sports, especially at the grassroots level. But it really begins in the home, because all of our athletes are being raised in homes, right? And in communities outside of the volleyball court as well. So it's important that parents get these messages, that teachers get these messages, that coaches get these messages, and of course that athletes start to absorb them. But also, I think more than ever, this current generation of youth, they're pushing back because they're seeing how difficult it was for their parents and for some of their heroes and their grandparents. And they don't want it for themselves. They're really neutralizing a lot of language that used to be very polarizing when I was young, for example. So this is a quiz that you can ask yourself, or if it's a parent listening in, or maybe you're a coach that's watching this right now, I want you to kind of challenge some of your unconscious biases or beliefs as they pertain to these 3 questions are connected about disordered eating. So this is where you've got an athlete who may be struggling with their body image, or it does not necessarily an athlete. It could also be a leader. It could be a coach. It could be you as a parent yourself. The first one being, ask yourself the question, if you can easily spot an athlete who might be struggling with their body image or disordered eating. You can easily spot them. So ask yourself that question. Second one, a good athlete and an athlete with disordered eating or who's struggling with body image and some of the behaviors are closely connected. And then the third one, risks for disordered eating are the same across all sports. Okay. So just think for a second what your answer might be. And here's some pre-populated answers, and we're going to be, Emma, we'll be sending out this slide deck as well, right? Because this particular slide has a ton of text on it. So I am just going to address, though, the answers to each one, or at least as I see them, as someone who's been working in this field for a couple decades. The first one is that you can't easily spot an athlete who might be struggling with their body image and has maybe taken to some disordered eating behavior. You can't necessarily. Not all athletes that are really struggling might appear underweight, for example, or what we would think to be largely overweight, right? And even those terms are very polarizing too. But you may not have seen a change in their appearance necessarily, but a struggle could be going on and behaviors could be going on that are antisocial and unhealthy as well, and unsafe. The second one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The second one is that this notion that a really good and dedicated athlete and an athlete who may be really succumbing to a struggle with disordered eating and with body image issues, that they are closely connected, and they absolutely are. I have never met an athlete who has been deeply in the throes of disordered eating who has not also had some truly outstanding dedication, right? They are the last ones to leave. They're the first one to show up a lot of times. They're the ones that are willing to do extreme measures for the team. They're often very selfless. There are many characteristics of a very intense, and sometimes it's linked to things like control and coping mechanisms. But you will often see, this doesn't mean that this person is a weak-minded person or that there's lacking some kind of morality piece here. It's quite the contrary. They're so closely linked in sport that they're very difficult to spot. And a lot of coaches will actually encourage an athlete who is doing extreme deprivation or who is dehydrated or who is overtraining, at least at first, until their health declines, of course, and maybe their performance. So we don't want to get to that place. We want to be able to spot some of the signs and symptoms and get that athlete some intervention, and not mistake the two. And then the last one is that the risks for disordered eating are the same across all sports, and they are not. There are some sports that are much higher risk. Some of those sports are ones like endurance sports, ones that rely on a very specific power to weight ratio, for example, things like cycling and athletics, distance running. Also aesthetic or judge sports, ones where judges are looking at the physical self and are literally judging that athlete on a point system, those are very vulnerable. Weight class sports are very vulnerable, like rowing or martial arts, a lot of the fight sports. And then the other category is the aesthetic sports that have a lot of body exposure or consciousness. And volleyball would fall in that category because particularly in beach volleyball, for example, you're in a bathing suit, you're not wearing very much. And the court volleyball has a very body conscious and sort of exposing a lot of, the beautiful physicality of all of us, but it can also lead to a lot of self-consciousness. So that renders a volleyball player more at risk potentially for some body image or disordered eating issues than some other sports. So that answer would be false. So depending on whether you're surprised or not, we do have some more information that we're going to be sending out after this webinar. We've got more information on some of the signs that you might be looking for if you were concerned about an athlete on your team, or maybe even about yourself and thinking, I need more education on this, or a coach wanting to know a little bit more about this particular spectrum here. It's the eating and body image spectrum. And you'll see on the far left, you've got, or up at the top, you'd have a lot of confidence and feeling kind of neutral about body shape and size, pretty flexible eating. They'll eat almost anything when you go on tour, if you've got a team meal. Then you'll see you get down the spectrum a bit and you've got more preoccupation. Maybe they're getting a little more picky with the eating. They're talking about dissatisfaction with their body, maybe a bit more. They're starting to look a little more self-conscious, not willing to really address issues to do with their body. And there could be lots of reasons for that, but that is one sign that we might be looking for. And then we get into more of the distress. So now it's causing a huge amount of distress to the athlete. They might be going out of their way to dramatically change their exercise regimen, the way that they dress, the way that they eat, and fuel themselves. And they may be struggling with other body image issues as well. And this goes, again, across the gender spectrum. So we know that this is something that can be hiding in plain sight, but we need to know how to spot it. We need to know how to talk about it with compassion and caring instead of fear. Because if we ignore it, a lot of times we get down into where I was working for so many years at the Ottawa General, which is in eating disorders. And this is where it is now pathological. It is now entering sort of in the illness category. And this would need to be treated, and they would need some third-party intervention and some assistance in order to heal from an eating disorder. So it's important that we at least touch on this tonight, because it is part of this broader discussion. If we're going to talk about body image, we need to know when things go sideways, what does that look like? And so I want now just to offer a trigger warning. I know that eating problems and eating issues can be very stressful to discuss. And so if you're watching this recording and you really aren't able to think about this right now or listen to this content, you might want to forward past this slide. This will be the last slide that I'll really be talking about this issue. But this preoccupation with either losing or gaining weight, because it isn't just about losing weight. We see with a lot of athletes too, they end up taking things like anabolic steroids in order to get more muscular. Or they might have an extreme fear of becoming fat, and they won't eat anything that they consider to be unhealthy. And that's a type of, it's sort of a hybrid diagnosis. It's called orthorexia, where they are afraid to eat anything that isn't deemed to be completely pure and healthy. And that's a very limiting belief system as well. So you can see on here, there are some more deprivation-related eating disorders, such as anorexia, or there's bulimia nervosa, where they're ridding their body of food after they have eaten a very large quantity in a short period of time, or there's binge eating disorder. So there are many of these, and we've got some support information. And I would ask anyone to reach out to some of the resources that we're going to also be supplying you with at the end of this webinar. And I've got more information for families and teams who would like to have a more targeted approach, or perhaps have more background information in this area of disordered eating as well. But we're now going to go more into the education piece and the prevention and some of the more body image related content after this slide, but it's important that we talk about this, we demystify this, we not make this something that no one wants to discuss, everyone whispers. We need to bring mental health and well-being to the forefront. That's the whole idea behind Emma and Volleyball BC's strategy, is to talk about mental health more openly in a safe, caring, compassionate way.
Shaunna, before we
Yeah.
go on, we did have
Mhm.
one question, and I'm not sure if it's going to be covered later, so I'll pop it
Okay.
in now. But
Mhm.
somebody has asked in the chat, how do you know when the increase of eating healthy habit turns into an obsession with food? And it's
Oh,
calorie.
well, actually, yeah, that's
Are
the
you
one that
going
I was
into
just
this?
talking about. I talked about orthorexia. I didn't even see that in the chat. Okay.
Yes. Is
That's
there, and
actually,
so that was the question, is there a new healthy obsessions category that's considered
well,
an
it's
eating
called
disorder?
orthorexia. It is. It's
Orthorexia.
called
Okay,
orthorexia. It's
perfect.
not in the diagnostic manual. It's one of those kind of in between. It's got elements of deprivation to it. It's sort of one of these, sort of a hybrid of many different eating and exercise issues. But the main thing is this preoccupation with clean eating, air quotes, right? Where, oh, I can't have that, it has sugar in it, or I can't have that, it's not completely pure, it has preservatives, or I can't have that because it has too much fat in it, or that's in a restaurant and I don't know exactly what's in it. It has nothing to do with allergies. It has nothing to do with sensitivities. It has to do with the perception of good and bad. Again, it's like a morality type thing. And healthy obsessions category is probably a really good way to put it, Patrina. That's exactly it. So, it might start out with the best of intentions, but then it gets out of control, right? And then you realize that this individual can't have a team meal with you. They can't even have most of the group snacks that you've provided. Their social circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and there's very little room for flexibility in this eating category, which is a place where we all meet and we gather and we socialize, and it's a life thief is what it is. That's what I call diet culture. It's the life thief, right? So thank you so much for that question. It's an excellent one. So I hope that helped. Um, so body diversity. I've got this awesome pic of one of our fabulous sitting volleyball players here. Body shapes and sizes vary, right? And they aren't going to stay one weight, shape, size for a lifetime. They're going to change. Things are going to happen. And so there's all kinds of things that will happen to our bodies. And when we get kids that enter our programs, for example, this sport of volleyball might be the very activity that we see them grow and change and morph all the way through many, many stages of their life. So it is critical that we have this very flexible way that we talk about bodies, and that we offer a lot of latitude about what a quote unquote healthy and powerful and awesome body can look like. And we need to start using that kind of inclusive language to make that happen. And that includes too the way that we talk about gender, the way that we talk about culture, ethnocultural backgrounds, right? So there are so many different ways that we have these complex mixes in each of us with, as it says on here, skin, eye, hair color, ethnocultural heritage, gender, all of that. Body liberation is trying to free us from that. It's where we're not necessarily talking about one ideal body type. It's more like, what can my body do and how can I get it to a place where I can have the most fun, be my most vital playing volleyball. I like using the word vitality. Where is my body its most vital? And a lot of athletes will tell me once they have, for example, recovered from an eating disorder, they're like, I'm finally playing at my most vital. I was either fighting to be heavier than my body really wanted to be, or I was fighting to be lighter or have certain body parts look a certain way. And in the end, it took away from my play over time. I became obsessed with it. It's all I could think about. I stopped even thinking about my sport, right? And so it challenges some of those stereotypes and opens that door to self-acceptance. So imagine if all these young people coming in and starting up volleyball could feel more self-acceptance through this beautiful sport, like how amazing, and how many athletes you would retain instead of lose some of them because they're too terrified of uniforming, for example, or that their body doesn't fit the sport, right? So these are 5 ways, and this is where we're going to start pulling in some of the ambassadors too and some of their lived experience. And these 5 core areas where athletes, coaches, parents, volunteers can really make a difference when it comes to enhancing body image and making everybody feel like there's a place for their body in volleyball. So we'll start out with number 1, which is the focus on communication and challenging your biases. So this is taking a closer critical look at how we talk about ourselves, how we communicate in writing, how we nurture body confidence and use empathetic and informed communication. One thing we want to make sure that we do as well, this sort of falling in this category of making sure that we've got an emphasis on well-being. There's an unrecognized and often misdiagnosed disorder that was sort of reframed around 10 years ago called relative energy deficiency in sport. It doesn't necessarily mean that an eating disorder is embedded in the relative energy deficiency, but it often is a part of it. And essentially, it's underfueling and overtraining, and it can show up in a bunch of other different ways too. So you might have low bone density. You might see this athlete is ill more often and is more succumbing to more injuries. They recover slower. They, in general, are underfueled, so they've got a real gap in their energy or their energy budget. So this sometimes is intentional because the athlete has just read something online, or they've started to play with their intake of fuel or overtrained, or it's unintentional and they just, going with the flow, and their body is changing and they're growing, and they're, unbeknownst to them, they're not getting enough of the nutrients that they need. So it's this combination of inadequate fueling and too intense exercise. And so we're looking for some of these signs up here that are on this sheet. And I have more information on relative energy deficiency in sport in some of the materials that we're going to be giving out after this webinar as well. So, and if you're confused about it, most physiotherapists now and trainers, some coaches, certainly at sport medicine clinics, et cetera, and medical professionals, some, if they work in sport, are more aware of it, many are not. So I think it's a really important education piece. These are some of the tips that, now there's too many to go over in major detail tonight. You can read some of them here for yourself, and then you'll get the deck distributed to you. But of course, we want to call out things like body shaming, right? This has become a very popular term, and I think most young people know what this means now. So really making fun or using disparaging language directed towards someone's body, right? And calling that out, that is not acceptable. It never was. But I think in today's day and age, where we're really trying to increase the well-being and stamp out things like bullying in sport, this is a really important point to point out. And some coaches may not even know that what they're saying is body shaming. So I've worked with many coaches, particularly in high performance, who are, pointing out certain parts of their athletes' bodies, or saying, wouldn't have made that mistake if you'd lost 10 pounds, or I can see where the 10 pounds went. That's body shaming, right? Telling an athlete that you can see where the 10 pounds went and that's why they missed a ball, that is not, weight is not a performance indicator. Power, speed, sure. We can't make a direct comparison between someone gaining or losing weight or how they fill out their uniform and how they perform that day. We can make some leaps, right? But ultimately, we need to stop making those types of equations, because what they do is they cause athletes then to go to extremes and not maybe address the real underlying cause, which is they didn't get enough sleep last night, or the quality of their training this week has been lousy, or they haven't eaten all day. Who knows, right? So, but a lot of those comments were like the mainstay of my career, right? It was normalized, that kind of behavior. Other things here, like given people support if they have experienced a lot of the body shaming, for example, and really being that compassionate place where we start to change that type of culture, refraining from those comments that essentially are anything about their body shape, weight, or appearance, and start focusing instead on skills, decision-making, vertical jump, mental skills, right? Things like coordination, if you're doing any kind of fitness testing, right? Figuring out if there's certain muscle groups or maybe some flexibility that needs to be added, maybe some prehabilitation, maybe some warm down exercises to avoid injury. There are a lot of things that we can avoid, or we can focus on, that will actually lead to higher performance versus shaming somebody for their particular body type. So that is another shift that I think we're starting to go in that direction. The oops, I didn't mean to advance that part of me. Ongoing education as well, looking at things like ethnicity, gender, religion, cultural background, and how that will affect someone's sense of comfort, right? So you've got someone with, let's see, I was working with athletics, for example, working with a sprinting group, and the sprinting group, that there were two that were from Samoa, and had this real island nation pride of where they were from. And when they arrived at that training group, this is in Eastern Canada, so filled with pride. But I'll tell you, the language about body types and how it changed them in a short period of time, from my first meeting to a month later, where their body type, which had been celebrated where they'd come from and wasn't being celebrated in Ontario, it's like they were these beautiful flowers that shrank right before my eyes. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to change in sport, right? They were flowers when they showed up, and it's our job to keep cultivating them. So all these ideas about reframing comments and words about weight, never engage in weight talk to motivate athletes. Again, let's talk about real performance indicators instead. Just wanted to look here and see. There's a few questions, so I'm going to address those in a little bit. They're excellent questions, and I might even get our ambassadors to help me with them too. Other ways that rigid body image causes harm: it can really add to weight stigma, more negative body image, obviously, a preoccupation with food. So food, instead of going from fuel and fun, becomes this almost punitive thing that is filled with tension now. They might miss opportunities, not want to eat with others. You're giving up really great team bonding experiences when you have to take food out of the equation, because it's such a polarizing issue for the team. And then, of course, I've mentioned before, an increased risk of eating disorder. So I've covered a ton of stuff right now. And I mean, I just thought one place that we might want to focus, for we've got these 3 amazing ambassadors that have played all over the place. They've gone all the way from development through to high performance. There were probably times when you were in programs where there was positive communication about bodies, but maybe you experienced, like me, sometimes where it almost got weaponized, or it wasn't so positive. So I don't know if you want to highlight the positive ones or maybe some of the challenges, but would any of you like to speak to some of your own experiences in this area? Our ambassador team, I'll just put it out to any of you if you got something.
I only have negative ones. I was waiting for Derek or Shanice to start.
Like, come on, somebody have a positive one.
I know. Well,
it's good we hear the negative though. Like, you know what? Because coaches and parents are going to hear this. We want to change this stuff, right? So let's hear it. You know, what are some
there's
things?
there's a list.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's such an important topic. I think it's so hard to talk about too, because it's so individualized for each person, and of course within each sport, and even between indoor and beach volleyball, it's just so it's so hard, because you can't just say, like, okay, find more confidence and be proud of how your body looks, because I think if you were to survey all of the volleyball players in BC and in Canada, I would say like 95% or higher, think about this. So I think it's a huge thing. So I'm happy that, Emma from and Volleyball BC, like, we're talking about this, because it is such a taboo subject. I would say it Probably through the grassroots level, coaches or parents or athletes talk about it in more, I don't want to say innocently, but it's just as you were kind of saying, like maybe people don't pick up on that you're saying that, or like, you know, glorifying that you've lost weight or that you look a certain way or after a period of time. I found that the higher I got in high performance, there was definitely more of a focus on body image, and whether that was through teammates, but it was mostly coming top down through coaches wanting body composition. Of course, the athletes didn't call it body comp, we called it fat testing. So we had to do that a certain amount of times throughout our program. And again, when you're just looking at your body comp and there's not really discussions around why you're doing it, or if that's met with how you're performing through the summer, and that's a discussion with your coach or any of the other people, I think that can also be pretty damaging. So I've had lots of experience with that, and just, again, communication or lack of with the staff and the athletes. And yeah, most of my horrific examples would come from playing professionally overseas, where they're just decades behind realizing that mental health is an issue, and just not to speak to athletes that way. I've been told to lose like 10 kilos in 2 weeks, which is insane. Wow. just to look a certain way. And yeah, just making sure there's, you know, comments dictated here and there, and you don't look like this, or you look like a bodybuilder or a weightlifter, or this, like comments that kind of course, like cut you down. And how are you supposed to go out and practice your best when you're dying on the inside? So I've had a lot of negative things like that. One of the questions was, I think, about the shorts, why volleyball shorts are designed to be tighter and looser. I won't answer that totally, but one thing is that there's, for national team, for a long time, and there probably still is, there's regulations on the inseam. So there was a while, I think, Shanice, that was still your time when you were playing indoor, but through NORCECA, the bigger governing body had an inseam rule. So your shorts couldn't be more than an inch from, you know, the body of the shorts. And so that was just, you can't really do anything about it, because otherwise you get fined. So there's a lot of other things happening too, but of course we can control what we're doing on our side, especially here in BC and with our teams. That, yeah, it's I could go on and on, but I won't.
Yeah.
But there's so many things to say with coaches and the environments, but luckily my worst have been overseas, although it's definitely still an issue, and was an issue for me growing up, and just so many people struggle with it. So it's definitely not something to, you know, shy away from if you're feeling like there's an issue, or if there's a player that kind of has that weighing on them as well.
Thank you for drawing the attention to some of the questions that we've been getting in the chat box. The one that's specifically about the shorts and some of the difference, like the length of the shorts and the uniforming, we're going to address that when we get to the flexible uniforms section as well. So let's make a mental note, panel, that we want to address that too when we get there. And you'll be more knowledgeable than me in terms of some of the international and the governing bodies. And I know university level as well, and in NCAA, they have their own restrictions. And finally, we've seen a massive like resurgence now in sports, including sports like gymnastics, where they're adding to some flexibility, and it's finally making more logical sense. And the uniforms are actually matching the demands of the sports and the comfort level of the athletes, probably for the first time in gymnastics history. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But thank you so much, Kyla. And we've got lots of other opportunities for the ambassadors too, to chime in a couple of minutes. Maybe on this next one too will be really great. This idea of focusing on well-being and challenging those biases, looking at true performance indicators. I've got some of them listed on here. So these are ones like power and speed, mental skills, work ethic. Those are performance indicators. Fat testing, or quote unquote body comp testing, is not a performance indicator. It can be used in conjunction with other things as being a health indicator, like, for example, how much someone is sweating, how much someone is metabolizing in the course of a busy weekend or a season, making sure they're getting enough nutrients. But it should never be weaponized, and it should certainly never be used as a performance indicator. And my experience has been that a lot of clubs and a lot of high performance programs and coaches use it as a performance indicator, and it's not. Right?
We've used it in the past, and everywhere, but with national team, it was usually in conjunction with our weight training, just to see the composition, which again makes sense. You're not just jumping on a scale and deciding if you're fit to be a volleyball player or not, but exactly, using it in conjunction. But I still think it needs to be utilized sparingly, and that communication with the athletes needs to kind of be open. But again, I think that there's far better measures of anything you're trying to measure. That can probably just be, excuse me.
Yeah, and also
kind of avoided.
And the way too that it's, because sometimes it is done, the weighing is done and the body comp testing is done in an open setting where everyone is privy to it. So doing a discrete weigh-in or a discrete measure is a better idea. Or if an athlete is already struggling with disordered eating, we may not even want to let them know their scores. It's not important for them to know their scores, but the strength and conditioning person and the coach might, in order to better manage the workout regimen for that athlete who's in recovery. So there's lots of things to think about when we're doing these arbitrary tests and we're not really explaining them, but especially to developing athletes. They don't even have a mature skeleton yet. They're still growing. They still have soft tissue that is growing and changing. And it's so critical that they maintain their bone mass and they don't start doing things like extreme dieting and deprivation. You're building bone density for life in your teen years. You don't get to build it later. So we don't want to start introducing some of those high performance measures in high school or early university years when they're not fully matured and developed. And I think a lot of coaches jump the gun and do that too early. So that brings us to this idea of well-being. So we really want to focus on, okay, but what is going to add to well-being in these athletes, right? So do we really need to weigh, a 14-year-old, like for what, right? So you hear about some sports that have started doing this monitoring, or parents are paying extra dollars to have strength and conditioning programs built for their athletes outside of the clubs. They're getting their children measured, right? And this does not take into account a lot of times the growth patterns, and we can't predict what their maturation is going to look like because we don't have a copy of their genetic code. We don't know when they're hitting puberty, and this can be a very dangerous game to play. So I really push back on coaches that start introducing this idea too early in adolescence, because in my experience, it's led to a lot of extremes and frankly, more injury and overtraining than anything else. So focusing on well-being, never compare or rank body measurements between athletes. We won't focus on all the horror stories tonight, but I've certainly worked with some high performance programs where, they're posting them on the wall and they're using them as a motivational method. And that is just not okay. And it doesn't matter where you are on the gender spectrum. Men are just as sensitive to that. And definitely the folks that are non-binary and female identifying are not loving that, seeing themselves ranked in their body comp on the wall, right? Needing to honor things like privacy, making sure that there is a professional, hopefully, if they are of an age where this is something, we're getting into high performance, where, we've just accepted a scholarship and we're working in this program, this elite program, maybe we We are starting to delve into some of this very specialized training, but we would hope that we would have a sports science and health professional to help moderate that as we go through. But again, it's not a performance indicator, right? It's part of more of a well-being picture that we're building for the athlete. It's how we position it. So finding other ways to motivate and build towards good performance, and that it isn't all about the body shape and size, right? It's what the body can do. And so it's a complicated combination. We also need to make sure, if we're going to be talking all about training and talking about the pressure and talking about the demands of the sport, we have to make sure that we're also building mental health assets so that athletes can cope, so that they can have a way to manage a sense of control and autonomy that they are in charge of. And so that could be internal assets, as is listed here on this slide. So maybe it's having a training journal, some relaxation skills, understanding what mindfulness is, breathing exercises, different types of activities, self-compassion, just being kind to themselves and keeping track of that. Or maybe it's having external assets. It's people that they can talk to, friends, other mentor coaches, maybe even a therapist if they really need some extra support, or someone who's charged with mental performance. But we need to make sure that we're supplying athletes with the ability to build those internal mental health assets. So I want you to think about, what are some of those most important assets for coping? What would that athlete want to develop further? Is that team or that coach or that parent providing these type of assets or opportunities for assets to their athletes? Because what happens if the athlete doesn't have those internal or external assets? They get inside this pressure loop, and this loop is there are things inside the loop that are within your control and things that are outside your pressure loop. You can see inside here, lots of things they're in charge of: quality training, quality of their mental skills, work ethic, their sleep hygiene at night, etc. There's a ton you can't control in sport, and that's all outside of the loop over here. And that pressure can really build up through the course of a career and an athlete's development. So if they don't have things that they can use inside that loop and mental health assets, many will lean to focusing on other places like their weight, like their body shape and size, because it's the one thing that I can control. And what we saw during the pandemic was, my personal practice went up about 300% for disordered eating issues because people were in lockdown. They couldn't control anything. They couldn't gather. They couldn't train and do all this, but they could hop on an exercise bike. They could manage their intake. And we saw it was the one coping strategy that they had. And many were lacking many of these other types of coping strategies. So that's why we saw this huge spike in disordered eating and body image issues over the course of the pandemic. And I don't want to go there again, right? So thinking about, what are some of those coping skills? Were there times, ambassadors on your teams, where your coaches did a good job of giving you some of those coping skills, the things that you could focus on that had nothing to do with body shape or size, or maybe you seek them out yourself? I'm just wondering if you have some that maybe you can recommend to the coaches and parents and athletes who might be listening to this right now. What ones were so important for you? Or maybe ones you wish you'd had? Anyone? Derek or Shanice, do you have any?
I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this, but I'm going to answer it anyways. I think for me, just with like this whole conversation, I am very lucky that I've had a lot of experiences, and I'm very lucky that I've, for the most part, generally had really positive environment in terms of, people involved, my own personal support system, communication. Aside from, similar to Kyla's experience being overseas, things are very, very different over there. But for the most part, I've had really positive environments and really positive communication, which has made it easier for me as an athlete going from development all the way through high performance to be fairly self-assured and self-confident in going through life, the changes of my body, and really trying to focus on my body as a tool for sport. I feel like that's how I've always tried to view it. I view, you know, food as fuel. How is this going to help me for performance? How are all of the things that I'm doing helping me performance? And so I don't really know if that's necessarily a coping strategy, but I think that was just my global view on, you know, how I got from being a developmental athlete. I knew where I wanted to go. What were the things that I could use as tools in terms of using my body as a vessel? Because we are playing volleyball, all you really need is yourself and a pair of knee pads and shoes, or if you're on the beach, a bikini, whatever. Um, how can I fuel myself for performance and keep that, um, I guess, essentially my anchor, and try not to sway from that too much.
That's a great message for youth to hear that. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you had so many, you know, positive foundational ones, so that then when you went to Europe, you know, you could kind of compare and know that I'm going to
Yeah,
stick to my anchor, you know, but it's hard. I'm sure it must have been really hard though, when you're thrown into that environment. It's just so different. I have no clue, right? It's just
totally,
unconscious, normalized, you know, it is what it is. I found the
totally.
same thing. What
Yeah.
about you, Derek? Thank you so much. And what about you, Derek? Do you have any in particular?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's sort of in contrasting the different experiences and I think similar to Shanice, I was quite fortunate, whether it was in the coaching spaces or in even in the physical, like physical training. I had a lot of, well, I think, again, what if we want to just focus on what was positive, I think having people who were able to encourage the things that were strengths, I guess, just like strength focused encouragement, things that were looking at, okay, what works well about my body, what works well about what I'm trying to accomplish as an athlete, and how do we kind of lean into sort of that unique aspect of what I bring onto the court. And I think that's something I tried to stay true to. I think it definitely became hard when, you know, you go to different environments, different teams, where all of a sudden there's this this expectation that you need to perform and be a certain way in order to I think at the time what I felt was that I needed to be, in order to be accepted. I think looking back now, I can see that on some level there was, you know, this is just what like coaches are kind of looking for in terms of the players that are there, and sort of what they're looking for in terms of when they're assembling in a team.
Yeah.
But you know, I think having coaches who were trying to find a way to foster my own strengths and then help me see those more often was definitely more helpful than people who pointed out my weaknesses and were constantly criticizing those and thinking that was going to motivate me.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's sort of one thing that kind of comes to mind.
Awesome.
It's
We
just
got
that,
combine that with Shanice's. You got sort of the magic combo there. Strength, strengths based. All the literature supports that, right? Like we've been missing that. You know, we've been missing that. A lot of not all coaches, but there's some, I think, just or they coach the way that they were coached, right? Where you're supposed to focus on the weak spots. And so that's a really great example. You know, you're a product of having those type of coaches that made you feel like your strengths were at the forefront. So note anybody who's listening tonight to this webinar. So thank you to both of you for that. And I mean, I think we can even look further if you look at social media and we think about what kind of role it plays in our lives today. I mean, the youth, they aren't watching network television anymore. We have very different multimedia exposures due to our highly digitized world. Plus they're walking around with a little, you know, multimedia device in there practically attached to their hip. And social media literacy for any coaches or parents that are watching right now, I mean, I'm sure they already have their concerns about the types of imagery that their athletes are seeing online, but really getting them to push back, similar to body activism, pushing back on some of the social media literacy pieces of what's even really real out there. We're only seeing highlight reels half the time, right? Of some of what these athletes can do. They're heavily filtered, they're edited, they're highlight reels. There were tons of missed balls, right? There were tons of failures. There were years of development that led into that one amazing highlight video. And so, you know, this add water and stir success that some youth may have like a very skewed view on what it takes to succeed in sport, but also what they're supposed to look like. And so since we're focused tonight on body image, but it's part of the bigger issue of self-image, I think we have to get into the nitty-gritty of social media literacy, and especially as it pertains to their athlete side. So a lot of athletes are trying to create their persona online. They're trying to get recruited, right? Some of them want to play post-secondary as well. So it's really important, that type of image that they build. And because so many of the images are heavily curated and don't necessarily represent reality, it really does a real number for parents and coaches that are trying to keep athletes down to earth and to make them understand the power of things like work ethic, but also not everybody's body looks like that, right? It's okay if you look a certain way and you're not completely perfectly filtered. What are they supposed to do with all of that information? So there's a program that's being launched. It's in sort of beta testing right now at the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and it's called Body Sense. I was part of the original team that developed it over 15 to 20 years ago, and we're re-envisioning it, and it's going to be an online module. And of course, I'll let everybody know when that is being released, but it's still in final stages of testing. But these are some of the areas from some of the curriculum of do's and don'ts that we may want to be introducing to athletes. So just thinking about what that reflection looks like, positive impact. Do be critical of what you see, like question whether something is reality based or not. Don't have to feel so much pressure that you have to disclose everything online. You don't have to make your life an open journal on social media. You can be private too. You know, try not to be disrespectful. Don't be afraid to step away if you're finding that this fear of missing out and this feelings of inadequacy of some of the people you follow make you feel bad about your body. You don't have to follow them. You don't have to follow that fitness influencer that spends 10 hours in the gym and looks like they're a character from a superhero comic book, right? So we have to start encouraging some of these more critical eyes and giving them a sense of autonomy over what they hold in their hand in that phone, right? And the persona that they're trying to build. So this is very tightly linked in a very complicated, messy way with self-image. So social media literacy, and there's tons of really great resources online. There's one called Media Smarts, which is a Canadian actually organization, a nonprofit. Lots of really great education for schools and families and even sport teams. So I'd encourage anyone to look up social media as well, because it has a huge impact, especially on youth. The third piece is a food first approach. So food first, really promoting the understanding of how to properly fuel the body, how to nourish it, how to embrace all parts of the food guide, right? And that there is no vilifying of carbohydrates, or you can only have proteins, or you can't have any fat, or you have to limit this, limit that. You know, most of the balanced approaches that are out there, especially for growing bodies, for athletes that are still young and they're still growing, there's a lot of really great information through our Canadian Sport Institutes, Dietitians of Canada. Try to seek out experts and people who have a background in dietetics versus someone who sees it maybe as a hobby and is being informed by perhaps the supplement industry. I'm not saying that all supplements are bad, but having a food and a variety of macronutrient approach tends to result in a more well-balanced view of that kitchen table. So just some of the ideas here: prioritizing use of food over supplement use, especially for developing bodies, Again, not comparing bodies, diets, or intakes of high performance athletes with a 14-year-old, not appropriate, right? So it has to be age and stage appropriate. They're so open to influence by who we're calling influencers, right? So just wanting to be careful about balancing that. And then if we're going to talk about food, think about how we talk about food. So all foods are morally equivalent. Okay, so a piece of bread and a stick of butter and an apple don't have a personality, and they're not out there committing crimes. Okay, they're food, they're fuel. And the more that we can look at them instead in terms of how high or low their nutrient value is, that doesn't give a morality to it. It's just more of a fuel indicator, right? It's not vilifying a fun food, as I call it, something like potato chips. They just don't have very high nutrient value. The second we vilify a food, it becomes desirable and something that we crave, and then we overdo it. And then we don't eat enough of the good stuff, the stuff that's high nutrient, right? So wanting to make sure that we're using words that are descriptive, like hot, cold, crunchy, salty, chewy, versus, junk food or health food, right? So again, just discussing that's sort of where this idea of orthorexia stems from as well. It's really high premium on foods that they deem to be healthy foods. So think about how you talk about food and making sure, so we can even swap out words like, if you've got an athlete, this happens all the time in my practice, be working with a young athlete, and then we start talking about at home and they say, well, my mom we don't have many carbs in the house because mom's on a low carb, diet right now, or we're not doing carbs because, so old habits die hard, right? And so they're getting a lot of these messages from parents, maybe even from coaches. I try to use like Energizer if I'm talking about carbohydrates. That's what it's there for. It's there for energy, both before and in recovery. It's critical. So athlete is on a low carb diet, that doesn't make sense, right? So we're wanting to make sure that families know this stuff as well. Fats are essentials and they're optimizers. So knowing more, so consult a dietitian, have someone come into your team and talk to your team about all the macronutrients that are essential to a balanced diet. And the proteins are the builders, they're the repairers. What are the best sources? Why is it so important that we get this stuff during cold and flu season? Why do we want a balance of all of them? I'm not sure if maybe some of the ambassadors want to talk a bit about that, the fueling for performance and the pressure sometimes we get from, outside sources. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's, I don't know, just the food industry. How did you kind of come to terms with sorting out your nutrient and intake, or was that a bumpy road sometimes? Or I don't know if you have any tips or things maybe you wish you'd done differently, like having a dietitian come in earlier on in your career, maybe. I don't know. Anyone have an idea?
Shanice, you go, because my child's being fussy.
Sure. I was just gonna say that I obviously played beach volleyball for 5 years, and beach volleyball is a sport where your body is the first thing that is seen by anybody that's watching, and so I think that comes with its own challenges if you are bought into this idea of being judged for what your body looks like. I'm very grateful to have worked with a really great dietitian, and she would educate us at the start of every season, how to fuel for intense weather, whether it's like extreme heat, extreme humidity, how to fuel for performance when we're in our everyday training environment. So I feel like I had a lot of education, but at the same time, I have always been someone who eats what I want, eats, what feels good in the moment. I tried not to restrict myself. I tried to, again, see food as fuel. And then when I reflect on my life as a developing athlete, I'm someone who was very, very skinny. I was very, very skinny as a young girl. And you know, we talk about this, like, or I mentioned this kind of communication and environment piece. And I can reflect on this now being an adult, but then I was getting lots of comments like, oh my gosh, Shanice, you're so skinny. You should go and eat a burger, as if being skinny was this, you know, negative thing. And I'm very lucky again that I've had really great supports that have, you know, put me on this track where food is fuel at the end of the day. And if something feels good or feels right in the moment, I'm going to eat that because it's going to fuel me for performance, or it's a sweet treat that I want on a day where I feel like I deserved it or I worked really hard. And why not reward yourself? I feel like it's very easy to get caught up in, you know, comparing yourself to other people. And I think it's just a matter of figuring out what works for you as an individual, getting educated as best you can, whether you're seeking out that education yourself or you have access to resources like nutritionists and dietitians. And then again, just surrounding yourself with people that are going to support the decisions that you make.
That's awesome advice. And it's interesting how, you know, you were feeling things at the other end of the spectrum, which was that you were too small, you know, and that you had to go eat a burger, right? Like nobody, according to who, right? Because like
exactly.
that was your body's, I call it your set point. That was where your body was its most vital at that stage in your development. And so because it didn't fit what somebody else thought it's supposed to look like, you know, it's just it's subtle, but it's powerful messaging, you know, when they're saying things like that. So thank you. That's an awesome tips and advice for anyone listening, you know, and to want to just eat intuitively what they want to eat, right? So number 4, and then number 5 is about inclusive culture. It's kind of tied in with number 4. So flexible uniforms, you can see one on the top here. So we have a hijab wearing female athlete who's also wearing full leggings and full sleeves, right? For modesty that we can presume with her hijab have to do with her faith. So we have had a lot of changes in recent years. I mentioned gymnastics. So down here we have a very outspoken and frankly body activism oriented German athlete who pushed to have this full length uniform for the Olympics and World Championships in artistic gymnastics because she was tired of fishing her her maillot uniform out of her rear end in the middle of competitions doing split jumps, right? And it just makes sense that you would transition to that. And it's sort of like what Kyla was saying earlier. The International Federation was the one that was dictating that female gymnasts needed to wear very tight and very sort of scant uniforming, especially in lower body, which was rendering them they felt quite vulnerable. And it turned a lot of girls, myself included, when I hit puberty, I turned away from gymnastics, in part because there's lots of reasons why, but the uniforming just didn't make sense for some of the things that we had to do in competition. I didn't feel comfortable in it. And now they don't have to make those choices, which is amazing. And then this group here in the middle, you can see it's an artistic swimming team. And in the past, you know, you'd have this really constricting bathing suit, and now they're picking styles that can be adaptable and a higher or lower hip height to suit the comfort and size of the swimmer, which I think is amazing. And so volleyball is getting there too, because now we've got the NCAA has started to change some of the lengths and restrictions on the shorts, for example, particularly with the women's uniforming. This is a theme you will see across the world over, that her identifying athletes have tended to be a little more body policed when it comes to do with our uniforming than men traditionally have. And there's lots of reasons for that. But I think sports are catching up. And I think that coaches, parents and managers, and even athletes themselves now are starting to question or want to encourage some flexibility in terms of what they can wear, making sure that there's some accessibility to maybe 1 or 2 options for the shorts. So maybe there's a boy short, but also maybe more of a scoop cut that some people feel comfortable with, and some might want a bit longer short, and that's okay. So I'm not sure actually if any of the ambassadors have any comments here about, have you had to go through any of the uniforming changes, or are these changes that are happening now sort of post-career for you, since some of them have taken into effect? Kyla, you talked about it a bit.
Yeah, definitely for the NCAA. Even it might actually be some pro countries that they're allowing tights, like full length tights to be worn during competition, which again, high performance, lots of the athletes that I was training with were practicing in tights anyways. Like, it is completely a preference. I know that Shanice can also talk about the beach uniforms, but I've heard, Sarah Pavin and Melissa Jimenez Paredes talk about how they want a smaller suit. It gives them, more range and freedom. So it's totally preference, and it's not, even if it's, deemed as being sexualized, it's again the athlete's preference. So certainly, especially at the youth ages, giving them that option is, I think, so great. And as a coach, you can definitely advocate for them if that's like not rules at a tournament. Again, if there's not international people coming down that are going to fine you hundreds of thousands of dollars, like you should be able to push back. And same with parents. I think why not? And yeah, just questioning why we have these things in place. The only thing that changed, I guess, during my time was it kind of went like, again, from a longer inseam in some competitions to the governing body of NORCECA making the inseam smaller, which I hated. And like,
it just sounds uncomfortable.
It was just ridiculous. And yeah, again, why? And then it did go back, and I tried to beat the system by, I think one of my junior national team had a longer inseam, but I was still the same number. So I transferred my older uniform that was number 4 to my senior one.
Crafty.
Yeah, so I was, trying to tweak it a little bit, because, like, God forbid I'm wearing these shorts. I get you're just you're thinking about that half the time than actually the next point. So, and then for our women's national team indoor, we changed our uniform to more of like the tight form-fitting kind of cap sleeves to it was more of like, it looked kind of like a traditional soccer uniform. And then again, depending on players' comfort, you could have that tighter or looser depending on how you wanted, which is what they're wearing today. So I've again kind of gone back and forth between that, but I am so happy that there's been some more movement, I guess, towards flexibility. It's a slow process, but I'm happy to see it. And I hope that there's definitely more of that happening at the grassroots level right now, because again, there's no reason why there shouldn't be.
No, that's a good segue. I wanted to just chirp in here from our perspective, and we are very, very flexible about what anyone plays in club volleyball. You have to have the same color, but I saw a question in the chat about trans athletes. Like, we do allow people to wear really like the shapes and cuts that they want to wear. Occasionally people can even ask for an exemption if they want to wear a different like style that suits their body type. We're super flexible. It has to look the same at first glance and the same color, but the cover, so I don't want people to think that, there is a preference for wearing a certain style of short that you see at indoor provincials everywhere, but it's not a stipulation by us. Like, it's usually the team or the individual that has purchased it. And there are lots of female teams who wear the basketball style short indoor, and lots that don't. But it's definitely flexible on our side, and same as well with even some of our adult tournaments as well. Like, we're very we don't set any uniform stipulations. At the Van Open, we had tank tops this year, and more covered up options for the players wearing, because again, we want to be more inclusive and make people feel comfortable. It's about the sport and not really about what people are wearing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but we think about the origin of the word uniform, right? Uniform meant you wear exactly the same thing. right? Like it's uniform. It is, and a lot of sport, you know, the breeding ground of the offshoots of organized sport were the military that also wore uniforms, right? To depict the side they were fighting on, and everybody was dressed the same. So we've come a long way. We're talking about centuries of development here. It's time we caught up. And it's just exciting to me that we're thinking more about how do we keep people included? How do we attract people that previously wouldn't have even wanted to set foot in some of our sports because they saw it as such a barrier having to wear that certain thing. And now it's like, oh, there's more latitude and flex now. Maybe I would feel more comfortable. So all this is moving in the right direction, which is amazing. At least it is in volleyball. It isn't in all sports. Not every sport is catching up, but
This is a really random note,
yeah.
but my father was a national team athlete in wrestling. And when I was in elementary school, he really wanted me to get into wrestling. And I didn't touch wrestling with a 10-foot pole just because of the suits.
Wrestling
And I was like, I'm not wearing that. Even if I'll go to the Olympic, I'm not. It's no.
It
So,
is.
yes.
It's a huge
It's a real
deterrent.
thing.
It's a massive deterrent for a lot of people, right? It's like, no, like that, you just look at it and does like that suit my personality and who I am and how I want to be represented. And I just think it is a huge role to play because it's a reflection of who we are, right? What we're putting over top of our bodies. So why wouldn't we want to get more people? You know, you're obviously never going to be wrestling, so who
Probably
knows?
a good choice, but
You may have missed your calling. How do we know, right?
Yeah.
You'll never know. You'll never know, Kyla. But
I know a little, but that's fine.
that's awesome. But so segue into sort of the last point of this idea of culture as well. So a culture of inclusion. Again, this is a bit of a catch-all for all the other things that we were talking about. So the way that we use language, the way that we talk about food, we use inclusive language to describe food as being essentially neutral, and that it is fuel and it is fun and it is, you know, nutrient dense or not so dense. We're wanting to create physical and psychological environments that meet our participant needs. We want to have environmental needs that are being met and have like a zero tolerance on things like bullying and the type of language that we've been discussing tonight that promotes body shaming, that promotes drawing attention to flaws or suspected flaws or perceived flaws, whatever you want to say. But the way that we talk about and the way that we make people feel like they can truly identify within our team as being a member of it, where they are accepted just for who they are. That's how, especially at the grassroots level, we're going to start attracting and I think retaining more athletes. So for coaches and for parents in particular, and even athletes themselves, adopting a body diversity approach to the way that they view building that athlete. So assume that every athlete's body that shows up and the person that shows up, they are capable of improving and enjoying your sport, right? And that's independent of that body shape, weight, size, particularly in development level. It gets harder and harder and murkier the higher you go in high performance sport. But certainly in those development levels, we have to be separating the two and recognizing and assuming everybody's capable of the health and well-being, challenging the belief on things like the body comp. Weight and size aren't viewed as a behavior. The focus is on self-care practices and on performance measures, and making sure that all body shapes and sizes get attention and coaching and the dedication that they all deserve. And that's a tall order sometimes too. Super quickly here, just another form for body activism in sports. Again, discussed performance indicators over and over tonight, drilling that point home. Make sure you're aware of what they truly are. Coaches, be very open and voice what those performance indicators are. Weight and body composition shouldn't be a key focus. Neutralizing the language, prioritizing fuel, ditch scales and body comp testing in general for development level. And if you do start later on, make sure that the body comp testing is done discreetly and that it's done in conjunction with a sports science approach towards athlete development and wellness. It's not done on its own or as a punitive means or a means to control, right? And just encouraging, just like Shanice was describing when she's eating and choosing what food she's going to have, she's eating intuitively because I feel like eating this today. I know I need a recovery snack and I feel like adding, I have a sweet tooth today. I'm going to make sure I add something that's sweet, or I want this, I want that. So combining your needs, but also with your desires and not being overloaded with guilt. Self-compassion is something that I think we could all use a whole lot more of, just being more gentle with ourselves. We're in a society and with images that are impossible to achieve, especially on social media. So self-compassion needs to be practiced by everyone. And I often push coaches and parents to start thinking about the way that they talk about themselves, especially in front of their children, if they're talking in a punitive way about their bodies. And just thinking, is that voice compassionate? Or is it harsh and critical, right? So not just the way we talk to others, but how are we talking to ourselves? Because our little ones are listening, our athletes are listening to everything we say. And I love this quote as well, that the body is an instrument. It's not an ornament, right? It isn't just to be looked at and be beautiful. It is beautiful inherently, but in sport in particular, you know, it's an amazing instrument that can make us do fantastic things. And the more we can honor that and honor well-being, I think the better off we're all going to be. So that's all I really had in terms of the content of the 5 prevention measures and awareness measures. Tried to address most of the questions on here. Don't know if there's any summary ideas that some of the ambassadors didn't have a chance to express. Now's a chance, you know, maybe if there's something that's been, you know, another war story about your not liking the wrestling uniforms, Kyla. Anything that we breezed past, Derek, that, you know, you was hanging on the tip of your tongue and you never got a chance to say.
Yeah, there was something that was kind of rattling through my mind that it feels sort of like body image adjacent in a way, which sort of just gets me thinking about as someone who grew up as a very like gangly, long, uncoordinated teenager. That can come with its own form of self-consciousness. And having moments where, you know, you get kind of laughed at or made fun of for stumbling over your own 2 feet or really struggling with a certain like skill in sports is body related, right? There's a body element to that. And I think it can definitely, for me at times, created feelings of my body's not good at this. I'm not doing this the right way. And, you know, I think it got me thinking a little bit more about, okay, what could that look like in a constructive way as like a coach? Because there is an element of, okay, we want to help you improve. We want to help you get more coordinated, improve your skill, your ability to jump and to run and to swing and to block, all of these like necessary skills for the sport. And I think like your question and the thought around like self-compassion kind of got me thinking about this, because the way I think about like self-compassion is like, you know, the critical voice, the judgmental voice is like, why are you like that? What's wrong? Like, why are you, you know, like kind of what's wrong with you? Why can't you do this? Whereas the compassionate voice is a similar question, but asked in a different way, which is like, hey, what's going on? Right? Like where you, I'm noticing like, this is really hard for you. I'm noticing that you're having a hard time being able to do this skill. Can we sort of figure out what's maybe happening? And it's not ignoring the issue. It's not ignoring that this is hard and maybe there might be some things going on, but it's the way we go about it. And, you know, I think I've had some coaches who are very open to that, are very like, oh, hey, this is a skill that's hard for you. And I can see, okay, let's work through it. Let's break it down. Let's kind of figure out some pieces to it. And again, it's in that spirit of wanting to get better, not wanting to just ignore that there isn't like something kind of going on here. I think about like in volleyball, we often encounter like goofy-footed athletes who kind of have the opposite feet to their swing, and it can look a little bit goofy, is sort of why it's got its name. But being able to work with that and kind of understand how it might be impacting some of the things that they can do in the sport. You know, similar to a lot of the other things you've been talking about with like the food and what's its like function, what's it helping with? Is there some, you know, way it can again, sort of a similar mindset with that. So that was all I kind of was thinking about and wanted to share that, and thinking like, yeah, there's also an element to that we can work with too.
I love that. Imagine if a coach or a parent even use that compassionate voice when they're coaching, and when they're asking it, the question in the way that you're suggesting it should be posed, like, what's going on, versus, oh, you're a klutz.
Yeah.
It's you're just changing the framing of the question that we're asked. Like, it's such a deliverance you're giving to that young person who's just growing into their body at that time, right? So I love that. Any coaches or parents listening, I hope you heard Derek's point.
I
That's
also think that like goes to show that like even with Shanice, growing up being too skinny, I was also a weed growing up, and it's just never good enough for anybody else.
right.
Like you're either too skinny, you're too big, you're this, that, this.
Exactly.
And it's crazy because yeah, it's like such an easy thing to say, like trying to impress everybody else. You're never gonna get there. And if you do, I don't know, that's also just getting older, I think, in life, like trying to impress other people. There's absolutely zero point in doing that, because it's just gonna be disappointment if you reach some kind of target. And I'll kind of echo what Shanice has been saying too, is that I was also really fortunate. I was always like so zeroed in on performance, and okay, like these are my goals as I'm a young athlete, and I want to make national team, and I want to do this, and even breaking down, as Derek suggested too, like through the skills. So same thing, food was also a fuel to me, and I was mostly focused on just how I'm going to build those skills to make it to my next goals, instead of, trying to restrict myself in whatever, in eating, as an example. I always was, nervous to not get the fuel that I needed in order to reach a certain performance. So my mindset was also a little bit different, but also to highlight, like, definitely not immune to what was happening around me or comments that were said, because that's certainly all around. There is a question. I'm just gonna. Katrina was just saying that it's often not the coach, but also the teammates that can bully body image.
It's the athletes.
Exactly. And that's also really tough. I've also been in situations where it's coming indirectly or directly from teammates. And I think like it's coaches and parents, the same thing like Shanice has talked about, a support system, but knowing what your goals are as an athlete, as your goals are as a team, kind of fostering that relationship with everyone and the environment. That's, again, it's a difficult thing to do, but if you didn't watch last webinar, go back and watch last webinar. But just having that environment of safety, I think, is really important. And yeah, just that open communication piece, I think, is really important, and why we're all here, what our goals are. We all look different. I have so many thoughts in my head. I won't keep going for so long, but I will say that I have had also a lot of education on surrounding food and fueling throughout most of my life. But that also doesn't mean that when they're giving you a guideline and you need to do these things, doesn't, like Shanice's eating plan isn't going to fit, my eating plan isn't going to fit Derek's eating plan. And so there, even though there is a lot of education, which I think is the first piece, especially for the youth, it's also about finding what works for you and what's going to make you feel really good going into practices and going into games. I've had teammates eat like a green salad before a game. I've had people eat like a monstrous plate of spaghetti and they crush it. Like, it's totally dependent on your body. So I think just, again, like honing in on your goals, honing in on what you need and what you need to feel your best, I think is like something that you can kind of focus on when things get a little bit noisy.
Yeah, it's very individualized, right? So we can go for the guidelines, get better education, but ultimately you have your own unique self, and we've got to be able to sort of combine outside information, education, but also intuitive eating, right? And what suits your body shape, size, age, stage, all of that. Amazing. So thank you for those sort of last few excellent thoughts on how we want to maybe ground ourselves as we wrap things up tonight. But just reminding everybody of some of these areas that we focused on this evening. And this is dipping your toe in the pool of a very huge topic of body image, self-image, disordered eating prevention, overtraining prevention. But I hope we've provided some ideas for places where you can focus, whether you're a family or a team or an individual athlete looking to make some improvements in their own life. I don't know, Emma, if there's anything else you wanted to address or just talk about. I did maybe want to draw some attention to for people if they're interested next month.
Yes,
some
this
information.
is going to be a good one about self-care and well-being, because as we're all headed into regionals and then provincials, everyone starts getting stressed, and we heard that was a huge topic for people. So I'm excited for us to learn more about self-care and hear from our ambassadors about how they do that and keep themselves sane in those crazy times. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't have anything other to add other than we will be sharing the slides with this. And then, as I said, this will become a resource on our website, and Shaunna will collate any of those additional resources or signposts to external organizations where people can find out more on this topic if they want to.
Right. And we'll be sending, and they'll have the PDFs available that are
Absolutely.
specific to
Yeah.
body image, right? Okay.
Yeah, that will go out too. So a huge thank you to everyone for coming, and a huge thank you to our ambassadors and Shaunna, and I wish everybody a great evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks. Have a nice night.